Okay, well, let's get started. We're Genesis chapter 29, and we're covering the story of Jacob. Jacob's our protagonist here and our hero, and he's going to get a wife because his parents don't want, well, his mother specifically doesn't want him to marry a Canaanite girl because Canaanite girls are no good. So he sends her to Padan Aram to I think it's his uncle. Anyway, chapter 29. Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the field with 3 flocks of sheep lying near it because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. Then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." "Look," he said, "the sun is still high. It is not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and a son of Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him to his home. There Jacob told him all these things. And then Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." All right. Um, Noteworthy there is that Rachel is a shepherdess, a female shepherd, and we know already that there's a theme in the book of Genesis of God choosing and favoring shepherds, going all the way back to the beginning. And so God, and for instance, Moses is tending sheep when God calls him. David is tending sheep when God calls him. So God, there's something about this image of shepherding that's right there in Genesis. And we call pastors, which pastor means is related to shepherd. Um, a pastoral scene is a scene of animals and taking care of animals. So, but the idea of this image of someone who protects, cares for, defends, provides for is an image that's there right from Genesis, and that's pretty interesting. And so, yeah, we'll pick up the story now in verse 15. After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. There's other ways to translate that. Delicate, the Hebrew word there is unclear meaning. Do any of you have anything different there for description of Leah's eyes? So that would be verse 17, the very first phrase. Leah had weak eyes.
Mine said tender-eyed, which who knows what that means. So
Right,
Mine says delicate. His eyes were
delicate, and I've got weak. Yeah, we're not really sure what that word means. In any event, what matters is that Jacob prefers Rachel, but Leah is older, so that creates a problem because as a father, you're supposed to get rid of the older one first, right? You said it. Yeah, no easy way to put that, I guess. So, but that's the tension now in the drama. So Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you for 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. And that's romantic, isn't it? It's beautiful. I think this may be, I don't know if, this may be the first time that a man and a woman are said to love each other. I have to look that up. I think we talked about this, but the very first time in Genesis, in which therefore the whole Bible, and in human history, the very first time one human being is said to love another is Abraham and Isaac. But here, the two, so this is a romance story, and it's significant. Jacob really loves Rachel, and it says those 7 years went by fast because they got to be together. I knew a guy, friend of mine, used to say when I was a kid, he would always say, "There's two kinds of minutes. There's Disneyland minutes, and there's mowing the lawn minutes." And of course, they're differentiated by their length, their subjective length. Obviously, a minute's a minute, but minutes don't all feel equal. And so when you're at Disneyland, the minutes seem to go by quickly. When you're mowing the lawn, they seem to go by slowly. So Jacob had Disneyland minutes for these 7 years. And so then in verse 21, then Jacob said to Laban, "Give me my wife. My time is completed, and I want to lie with her." So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave them a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and gave her to Jacob, and Jacob lay with her. And Laban gave his servant girl Zilpah to his daughter as her maidservant. So he did the bait and switch technique there. Waited till after the party. Now a funeral, or not a funeral, why am I saying funeral? That'll get me in trouble, right? A wedding ceremony, there'd be a betrothal where a girl was promised to a man, a woman is promised to a man, and then the wedding would be essentially this big celebration, a feast, a party. And that's what Jesus, for example, is attending when he turns the water into wine. And these feasts were long, heavy parties, and there was often drinking. And by the time the night was over, it would be dark, and people would be intoxicated, and so something like this could be pulled off. Well, when morning came, verse 25, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I served you for Rachel, didn't I? Why have you deceived me?" Now, notice what's happening here, right? We modern people would say, well, this is what? Karma. Do you see it? Do you see the karma here, or the irony? Maybe it's not irony, it's the poetic justice, right? Because what has Jacob done that is like this?
Oh, sneaky, yeah.
Jacob tricks his father
Yeah.
and pretends to be a sibling that he's not.
Right.
Well, now Laban tricks Jacob, giving him a sibling that he doesn't want. So there's symmetry here, a sort of poetic justice here, that Jacob, in a way, is getting what he deserves. I think. Yeah. So here we are. Now, so Laban has tricked Jacob in just the same way that Jacob's tricked his father and tricked his brother too. Laban replied, "It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish the daughter's bridal week, then we will give you this younger one also in return for another 7 years of work." And Jacob did so. He finished the week with Leah, and then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant girl Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her maidservant. Jacob lay with Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he worked for Laban another 7 years. So we've got a favored wife, which is, a bit sad. But the theme of a favored wife and childbearing runs throughout Genesis 2. what we'll see is that, in a sense, Leah is more fertile though than Rachel. And some rabbis and some scholars, theologians, read this and say, well, that's God's compensating Leah for not being the beloved wife. Instead, she gets to have more children. Rachel will bear Jacob 2 children, and not until later. For a long time, Rachel will be childless. And so all the older, and these children, by the way, become the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? But the 2 younger children are also end up being the children that Jacob loves the most. And you know who they are? Um, so Jacob's going to have 12 children, 12 sons. The first 10 are all from Leah. And the last 2 will be Joseph and Benjamin. And Joseph is the one that his father loves the most. Gives him the Technicolor dream coat. We'll get there, though. So anyway, but there's some foreshadowing here that Rachel is the beloved, is the wife who's loved more. Now, verse 31, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. See, Rachel is loved, but barren. Leah is fertile. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She named him Reuben, for she said, "It is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now." And so, yeah, this you could see why the rabbis would say it doesn't say exactly why God does this, but it can be assumed or it can be implied or inferred that God is compensating her for not being as loved. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Because the Lord heard that I am not loved, he gave me this one too." And that's what Leah assumes is going on. So she named him Simeon. Again she conceived, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "Now at last my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons." So he was named Levi. And these names are familiar. If you know the story, these sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. And Levi becomes the tribe who is the priests. So Levi's the 3rd son. She conceived again, and when she gave birth to a son, she said, "This time I will praise the Lord." So she named him Judah. Then she stopped having children. Judah's the 4th son, and this is the son through whom we will get Jesus. So Jesus is sometimes called the Lion of Judah, right? And that's where this reference comes from. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" Then she said, "Here is Bilhah, my maidservant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and that through her I too can build a family." There's a lot of repeated patterns here. What is this like? Right? This is like what Sarah does with Hagar. Sarah says to Abram, "Take Hagar, sleep with her, and have a son." And of course, that gives us Ishmael. So we just repeat patterns, which is true actually in real life. Family patterns tend to repeat, don't they?
Yeah.
Okay. So she gave him her servant Bilhah as a wife. Jacob slept with her, and she became pregnant and bore him a son. Then Rachel said, "God has vindicated me. She has listened to my plea and given me a son." Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a 2nd son. Then Rachel said, "I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won." So she named him Naphtali. When Leah saw that she had stopped having children, she took her maidservant Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, "What good fortune." So she named him Gad. So we got the 2 wives are competing for who can provide the most male heirs. This was a big deal back then. I mean, it's silly to us now, but I always think because I was an English major and I loved Renaissance literature. I think about Henry VIII going through all those wives to get a wife that would give him a male heir. it really mattered back then. All right. So verse 12, Leah's servant Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, "How happy I am! The woman will call me happy." So she named him Asher. During wheat harvest, Reuben went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants, which he brought to his mother Leah. Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she said to her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" "Very well," Rachel said. "He can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." So when Jacob came in from the fields that evening, Leah went out to meet him. "You must sleep with me," she said. "I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he slept with her that night. It's like a soap opera. It's great. God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, "God has rewarded me for giving my maidservant to my husband." So she named him Issachar. Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, "God has presented me with a precious gift. This time my husband will treat me with honor, because I have borne him six sons." So she named him Zebulun. Sometime later, she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah, and she'll become important in the next story. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and opened her womb. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, "God has taken away my disgrace." She named him Joseph and said, "May the Lord add to me another son." Jacob's flocks increased. So we're verse 25. After Rachel gave birth to Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can go back to my own homeland. Give me my wives and children for whom I have served you, and I will be on my way. You know how much work I've done for you." But Laban said to him, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." He added, "Name your wages, and I will pay them." Jacob said to him, "You know how I have worked for you and how your livestock has fared under my care. The little you had before I came has increased greatly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I have been. But now, when may I do something for my own household?" So Jacob wants to work for himself now. He's done working for Laban. Laban has heard, apparently divination is like reading tea leaves, or the Chinese use the sticks. I don't know if you've heard of those, or but divination was a way. Then there are different mechanisms you could use in the ancient world. You'd read the guts of an animal that you sacrificed. Our version of divination is horoscopes, but you read the stars, in other words. But you'd use something, the stars or tea leaves, or in the case of the Chinese version of it, you'd throw sticks on the table and see how they land. Anyway, but it was a way that you could find out what the will of the gods was regarding you, or your fate, or what your future would hold. So, and the law will forbid divination, but we haven't got the law yet. So Laban here hasn't done anything wrong, or he hasn't done anything that he knows is wrong. And he's found out that the reason why his flocks have done well, the reason his business has been good, because Jacob is with him. So Laban doesn't want to let him go, but Jacob does. Jacob's now given him 14 years. It's understandable that Jacob would say, "Look, I want to build my own life here." So anyway, I've worked for you, the little you had. Verse 31, "What shall I give you?" he asked. "Don't give me anything," Jacob replied. "But if you will do this one thing for me, I will go on tending your flocks and watching over them. Let me go through all your flocks today and remove from them every speckled or spotted sheep, every dark-colored lamb, and every spotted or speckled goat. They will be my wages. And my honesty will testify for me in the future whenever you check on the wages you have paid me. Any goat in my possession that is not speckled or spotted, or any lamb that is not dark-colored, will be considered stolen." "Agreed," said Laban. "Let it be as you have said." That same day he removed all the male goats that were streaked or spotted, and all the speckled or spotted female goats, all that had white on them, and all the dark-colored lambs, and he placed them in the care of his sons. Then he put a 3-day journey between himself and Jacob, while Jacob continued to tend the rest of Laban's flocks. Jacob, however, took fresh cut branches from poplar, almond, and plane trees and made white stripes on them by peeling the bark and exposing the white inner wood of the branches. Then he placed the peeled branches in all the watering troughs, so that they would be directly in front of the flocks when they came to drink. When the flocks were in heat and came to drink, they mated in front of the branches, and they bore young that were streaked or speckled or spotted. We know that doesn't really work that way, but that's okay. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves. They didn't know genetics when they wrote this book. So,
But it seemed to have happened,
yeah,
apparently, in their stories.
it turns out okay for Jacob. We know that this really, where, what kind of branches animals mate in front of don't determine the genotype or the form. What do they call it? There's the genotype and the, can't remember the other word for it. But anyway, what the animal looks like is not going to be determined in this way, but that's the way the story goes. But it's the point, I think, again, we have this kind of, I don't know, what goes around comes around of trickery, of deceit. And it begins with Rebekah and Jacob deceiving Isaac, and I guess Esau's deceived too to some extent. Tricked, deceived, cheated. And it puts this domino effect into place of everyone in this family is cheating and tricking each other. Yeah, so Jacob and his mom do it to Isaac and Esau. Laban does it to Jacob. Now Jacob's doing it back. All right. Thus he made separate flocks. Jacob set apart the young of the flock by themselves, but made the rest face the streaked and dark-colored animals that belonged to Laban. Thus he made separate flocks for himself and did not put them with Laban's animals. Whenever the stronger females were in heat, Jacob would place the branches in the troughs in front of the animals so they would mate near the branches. But if the animals were weak, he would not place them there, so the weak animals went to Laban and the strong ones to Jacob. Again, Jacob is out tricking his uncle. This way the man grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and maidservants and menservants and camels and donkeys. All right, we're in chapter 31 now. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. Not a shock. Then the Lord said to Jacob, "Go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." There's that promise again. I will be with you. God, the force will be with you, right? God will be with you. The force will be with you is an imitation of this, actually. Obviously, this came first. So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, "I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I've worked for your father with all my strength. Yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, we haven't heard that before. This is news to us. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. If he said, 'The speckled ones will be your wages,' then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, 'The streaked ones will be your wages,' then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and has given them to me." That's not entirely true either, is it? I mean, according to the story, if we accept the terms of the story, it's Jacob that's been engineering how this turns out, not necessarily God. "In breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, 'Jacob.' I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said, 'Look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted. For I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel." That's where Jacob had the dream. Remember the dream of Jacob's ladder. And he wakes up and he puts the altar there. "Where you anointed a pillar and where you made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land." Then Rachel and Leah replied, "Do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you." Then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all his livestock ahead of him, along with all the goods he had accumulated in Paddan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him he was running away. So he fled with all he had, and crossing the river, he headed for the hill country of Gilead. So the deceit compounds, and now we're stealing idols. This is interesting. I mean, Jacob, one thing to note here is that Jacob is not totally a monotheist yet. Jacob talks about Yahweh, the God we know as God, as his father's God, and he's made, in a sense, a deal with this God, right? Remember the prayer that Jacob prays? Not a totally pious prayer that says, "Look, if you take care of me, if I come safely, and if you make sure everything's okay, then you'll be my God, and I'll be your servant." But that's not the same thing, see, as saying you're the only God. Jacob is promising his devotion to this God, but for Jacob and for his uncle and for Rachel and Leah, God is not the Yahweh is not the only God. There are other gods too, and so the daughters are stealing the household gods, and they would still maybe be worshipped, And idolatry and it's no different today, but idolatry in the Bible and in ancient times, a lot of it was about hedging your bets, right? That a lot of these gods were fertility gods, gods of harvest, and so worship was about what you could get. So, and there was a lot of anxiety, understandably, in those times about how well whether there'd be a famine or not, and so you would give worship to these gods to make yourself secure, right? And that's why we say we worship money, right? Because where do we get our security from? We get our security from money. Well, it's the same. Only back then they would worship these idols, and these idols they believed, would give them security in the form of a successful harvest or rain, not having a famine. So that's what we're seeing here. And these gods would often be valuable too. The idols would be made out of precious metals, and so would represent something that was valuable. All right, verse 22. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled, taking his relatives with him. He pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban the Aramean in a dream at night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and Laban and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You've deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you?" He's got some nerve, doesn't he? after the way he's treated, I mean, Laban has been just as deceitful as Jacob has. They're just, these two guys deserve each other in a sense. But here Laban's acting all incensed. "Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of tambourines and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You've done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you, but last night the God of your father said to me, 'Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad.' Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" Jacob answered Laban, "I was afraid, because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who has your gods, he shall not live. in the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it. Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So Rachel is clever. Rachel is like Rebecca. She is the smartest one in this family by far. And you watch what she does. Uh, Now, so Laban went into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the two maidservants, but he found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched but could not find the household gods. Now, a woman's menstruation was, in this time, even was considered unclean. And so, yeah, and this is very, I think, satisfying for a lot of women to read because that seems very unfair for women to be considered unclean and for them to be, in a sense, sequestered during their time. But here Rachel's using that to her advantage. Rachel said to her, "Yeah, don't be angry. I couldn't find the household gods." Jacob was angry and took Laban to task. "What is my crime?" he asked Laban. "What sin have I committed that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between the two of us. I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten rams from your flocks. I did not bring you animals torn by wild beasts. I bore the loss myself, and you demanded payment from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime and the cold at night, and sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for the 20 years I was in your household. I worked for you 14 years for your 2 daughters and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you." Laban answered Jacob, "The women are my daughters, the children are my children, and the flocks are my flocks. All you see is mine. Yet what can I do today about these daughters of mine, or about the children they have borne? Come now, let's make a covenant, you and I, and let it serve as a witness between us." So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. He said to his relatives, "Gather some stones." So they took stones and piled them in a heap, and they ate there by the heap. Laban called it Yegar Sahudatha, and Jacob called it Galeed. Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me today." That is why it was called Galeed. It was also called Mizpah, because he said, "May the Lord keep watch between you and me when we are away from each other. If you mistreat my daughters, or if you take any wives besides my daughters, even though no one is with us, remember that God is a witness between you and me." It's pretty straightforward. Laban has his interests. He wants to make sure that his daughters and grandchildren are treated well, that Jacob doesn't get other women and neglect his family.
I know. Well, I keep wondering in the Old Testament that it's so common that they
Oh, polygamy?
had more than one
Mhm.
wife.
Yeah. It was common all the way up until the time of Jesus for there to be polygamy. And really, it was never. There's nowhere in the Old Testament that forbids polygamy. Nowhere in the law. Yeah, it had just become. By the time of Jesus, it had become something that was informally not done. Right? It was never expressly forbidden in the Bible, but the rabbis had begun to see it as a practice that was more troublesome than it was worth, I think. And so by the time of Jesus and by the time the New Testament's written, there's a taboo against it because the New Testament forbids, having more than one wife. At least Paul does in some of his letters. So, yeah, polygamy really is never forbidden by the Bible. It's just something that falls out of practice.
Because it's a better way to live.
Yeah,
Peace in the family.
yeah. I mean, you can see how much trouble even here, you can see how much trouble it causes. It's, um, it's also, I think there's a few reasons. I mean, I think it doesn't make for very stable families, which we can see here in Genesis. But you can also see how in a way, it's economically unfair. There's a class issue, which is if you could afford to have a lot of wives, you could marry, you can marry all these women. I mean, Jacob's got right now 4 wives. But if you're not rich, if you don't have large flocks, then what about you? You're taking all the women. And so in a way there's a justice issue. There really is a justice issue with wealthy men getting to have as many wives as they want, and then poor men not being able to have, not there wouldn't be enough women for everyone to have wives. So yeah, there's family values issues and there's economic justice issues with polygamy. Okay, where were we here? They've taken the vow. They set up the heap of stones. I think we're at verse 53. May the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, the God of their father, judge between us. So Jacob took an oath in the name of the fear of his father Isaac. He offered a sacrifice there in the hill country and invited his relatives to a meal. After they had eaten, they spent the night there. Early the next morning, Laban kissed his grandchildren and his daughters and blessed them. Then he left and returned home. So the story ends, at least, if not happily, peacefully. And Laban is now out on his own. The next story, well, here's what we'll do. Let's take chapter 32 to verse 21, because we'll have the reunion between Jacob and Esau. It's a very beautiful story. I think I preached on it a few weeks ago, but it's a story of forgiveness, and it shows you that forgiveness is a key element of our faith right here from the beginning in Genesis. Jacob also went on his way, and the angels of God met him. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of God." So he named that place Mahanaim. Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. He instructed them, "This is what you are to say to my master Esau. Your servant Jacob says, I have been staying with Laban and have remained there till now. I have cattle and donkeys, sheep and goats, men servants and maid servants. Now I am sending this message to my lord, that I may find favor in your eyes." When the messengers returned to Jacob, they said, "We went to your brother Esau, and now he is coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him." That's a ambivalent and somewhat ominous phrase. Esau's coming to meet you with 400 men. What does that mean? That's after what Jacob has done. Jacob is understandably terrified. When the messengers returned to Jacob, verse 7, in great fear and distress, Jacob divided the people who were with him into 2 groups, and the flocks and herds and camels as well. He thought, if Esau comes and attacks one group, the group that is left may escape. So at least Jacob says, I'm going to split my party up, and at least something of my family will survive. Then Jacob prayed, O God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. I had only my staff when I crossed this Jordan, but now I have become 2 groups. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children. But you have said, I will surely make you prosper, and will make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. So Jacob is looking for God to fulfill his end of the bargain. Keep me safe. He spent the night there, and from what he had with him, he selected a gift for his brother Esau, 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 female camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bulls, and 20 female donkeys and 10 male donkeys. He put them in the care of his servants, each herd by itself, and said to his servants, "Go ahead of me and keep some space between the herds." Jacob, um, that's another people I think have a kind of romantic. Well, I don't know. I don't know how how you're used to thinking of these of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, but they were wealthy. They were in the top 10% at least of their society. This is a sizable gift. Your average man living at that time didn't have this amount of animals. So yeah, we're looking at the upper class here. They were wealthy and powerful. He instructed the one in the lead, "When my brother Esau meets you and asks, 'To whom do you belong, and where are you going, and who owns all these animals in front of you?' then you are to say, 'They belong to your servant Jacob. They are a gift sent to my lord Esau, and he is coming behind us.'" Jacob wants the first thing Esau sees to be this gift. He wants to make a good impression. He wants Esau to be kindly disposed to him. He also instructed the second, the third, and all the others who followed the herds, "You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him." So it's not just one gift, but it's Jacob wants to say, "Here, these are yours. Here, these are yours." He puts in between him and Esau several lines of protection in the form of these gifts. You are to say the same thing to Esau when you meet him, and be sure to say, "Your servant Jacob is coming behind us." For he thought, "I will pacify him with these gifts I am sending on ahead. Later, when I see him, perhaps he will receive me." So Jacob's gifts went on ahead of him, but he himself spent the night in the camp. This is also analogous to what countries would do, kingdoms, right? You would pay tribute. If you had a smaller kingdom, and we know that the Israelites had to do this with Egypt and with Assyria and later with Babylon, the bigger countries would, say, "I'm going to come visit you." The king of Assyria would come to visit Israel, and Israel would give gifts, and those gifts were, in part, they were tribute. They were to say, "Leave us alone," right? Because if you didn't give the tribute, the king of the bigger country might say, "Well, why don't I just conquer you and take over?" But if you would, tribute was a way of saying, "Look, you'll get benefit from us, but you won't. You don't have to conquer us. We'll give you some good things, but you leave us alone," right? And that this is a smaller scale version of that. It's politics, in other words. Jacob, verse 22. No, we'll stop there. Actually, we're 5 minutes till. We'll stop there. Next week we'll take up the story of Jacob wrestling with God. This is a very strange but very interesting story. We'll take it up. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, we thank you for a new year, and we thank you for your word. Help us to see your work and your kindness and your faithfulness in the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and what it has to teach us about our relationship with you, about your goodness and your faithfulness to us today. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.